So I'm going to try and explain the damp proofing industry and why it's gone so wrong. So no one is disputing that water can rise up a porous brick or any building material, but it will only rise by about 10 centimeters if there's nothing underneath it to push the water up. And that thing underneath it can either be a membrane, it can be the water table, which is the cause of groundwater, the source of water in rising damp, or indeed it can be a drain that isn't functioning properly and cracked, and that should be dealt with. Otherwise you could end up with subsidence, which is obviously going to be a greater problem than rising damp. So the only thing that can't be dealt with is the groundwater, and that's the water under the water table. But in London, all the water is pumped out and historically has been. Even if it wasn't pumped out, you're in an area of London that doesn't have groundwater in the rocks below your property. In London, there are the old rivers and streams that fill the whole area, but they now have underground drains that take the water away. Occasionally you'll get the odd property that's built above one. Mainly they're turned into roads and there are no real problems, but there's certainly an area that I know relatively well near Brixton, where it was the part of the Effra River, and a big pipe has been put in underground. Now, there are a few tips and tricks to take on board. One is to look to see whether you've got a leak and you've got one of these analog digital dials in the center and it's not moving. Well, it is now because we turned the tap on, but that's a really good way of testing for a leak. There are other ways. Have a look at my videos on that. The other thing is to know where your drainage is. So sometimes you get drains through properties. This is a property very near you, and if you've got a drain that's cracked, then that could be the cause of dampness in the subfloor void, and then that needs to be sorted out, not rising dampness. Now, this is a test for nitrates. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because there are lots of false negatives, false positives. This is an example of hygroscopic salts. Now, hygroscopic salts is probably the reason why the damp proofing industry exists, and it's certainly one of their justifications. But you see on the outside of properties this band of dampness, and that is because they're hygroscopic. If they were normal salts, if they were, or at least if there was no salt in it, you wouldn't get the band above the ground. It's because it's evaporating, condensing around the 50% relative humidity mark that they are on bricks higher up the wall. They're normally from chimneys, from the burning of coal. They can be from equine urine and various other things, but including from groundwater. But because groundwater is so rare, that's the least likely cause of hygroscopic salts. So have a look for the sort of bullet holes you get at the base of the wall. That's an idea that the property's been treated in the past. And the number of times you get people, damp proofers, recommending more than one treatment for the same property, which seems very odd. You'll tend to get this type of report. The main players in London, particularly, they go around to all the estate agents and try and convince them. Now, what they say is that they go out to find rising damp. They never say that they found it because they know that they can be sued for that. They look for rising damp, they find damp, they recommend damp proofing treatment, to essentially treatment should there be a problem for a theoretical missing damp proof course. Now, I had a long chat with one who very kindly let me have a look to see what work he was doing. So what they're doing is they replace the normal permeable plaster up to, in this case, I think almost 1.8 meters. Now, this property has already been damp proofed in the past. This is often known as slurry, damp proof as slurry, or they call it tanking material, but essentially it's impermeable. It stops water coming through. So if there's a leak, it won't show. It was devised for hygroscopic salts because hygroscopic salts, you need to have a barrier. Everything else, you don't. And there's a much cheaper modern way of doing it using Zinsser cover stain. So now we have a look at your property. Two things to note. One is that there's dampness at the base of the wall, and two, there's mould. Where you get mould, you can't have rising damp because mould is inhibited by the hygroscopic salts found in rising damp. You can see that it's had a lot of people testing it with the pinprick damp meters. No doubt it made a shrill sound. Yes, that it indicates that there's dampness. All forms of dampness are going to be more at the base of the wall than higher up because obviously gravity is pulling them down. Once the base of the wall becomes damp, it loses temperature, increases the risk of condensation. So where you've got mould, you can only get mould where you've got excess vapor. That is where the internal dew point is greater than the external temperature. We'll discuss that more later on. Having the curtains there means that you're not going to get the airflow from the radiator, so that wall is going to get colder than it otherwise would do, and it increases the surface relative humidity. There are 3-4 simple ways of dealing with it. One is to increase the airflow from the radiators, 2 is to use insulation, 3 is to increase ventilation, and 4 is to use dehumidification. You can also use anti-mold sprays, but they're not perfect. And none of those work perfectly. The one that probably works the best is a dehumidifier. And if you think of the International Space Station, one of my clients was in charge. They require mold as part of their training because you will get mold in the International Space Station. But also the thing to know is that they have no ventilation, so they have to have dehumidification. Now you can see the condensation taking place on the window frame. That's metal, and where you get those dribble marks, that will be from condensation, and that lines up with our knowledge and understanding of this property. The rear wall is dry at the time of the survey, but then it has had the summer to dry out. I personally don't use the pinpricks because they're more for condensation rather than any other source of dampness, but they're useful. But I prefer the radio waves. Now, you've got no extractor fan from above the hob, but you have a separate one, which is actually a bathroom size extractor fan. I think it's only running at about 15 litres a second. And you've got an open plan kitchen, which is in the centre of the property. So it means that vapour is going to escape necessarily from the kitchen. And not much we can do about that other than increased ventilation and dehumidification. Now, in the rear room, you've got rot. Actually, probably the most complex, difficult thing to deal with in a property is rot. You've got it in the rear room. It's a white rot. It's essentially window rot, and it's above a solid floor, and therefore it's localized. You can just remove that piece of timber and repaint it. It looks like window rot, but there aren't too many telltale signs. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter what rot it is. Better that it's not dry rot because that spreads more rapidly, but there are no telltale signs of it being dry rot. But even so, you replace that piece of timber and deal with the moisture. Now, the wall temperature here was dropping below 18 degrees centigrade, and I think this is your key problem, and we'll look at the reasons why that is. If you look, you've got the Dalton tubes outside. This is a form of damp proofing. Well, they're all pretty bad, but this is one of the least good because what it does is it introduces cold air into the base of the wall. You can see you've had other damp proofing, so you've been damp proofed twice before. Almost all the properties I visit have previously been damp proofed. if it worked, I wouldn't have a business, and in fact, the damp proofers wouldn't have a business. But clearly it doesn't. You're introducing low temperature to a critical part of the wall. You've got more external surface area, so you've got increased heat loss, which means that you're going to lower the temperature of the wall. Now, this is the kitchen extractor fan is running just below 15 litres a second, which is the speed of a bathroom extractor fan. Bathroom extractor fan is running at about 18.7, which is good. You need to keep it on for at least half an hour after a shower and keep the door closed. So what you need to focus on is the dew point. Do you see the dew point there? So it shows 9.92. So the dew point is a measure of the amount of vapor in air expressed as a degree centigrade. It's also the temperature where condensation takes place at. And actually mould is liable to take place 3 degrees centigrade above the dew point. But focus on the dew point and keeping it below the outside temperature. In a perfectly ventilated property where you're constantly blowing the internal vapor and replacing it with external air, it will never go above the external dew point, because when it rains outside, the air is at the dew point. So the highest temperature it can ever, the highest dew point the outside air can ever get to is the outside temperature. Otherwise it condenses, and rain is condensation. And so in fact, when it's raining outside, you need to use the ventilators a lot more than otherwise, or dehumidifiers. So I put the information on the website. It's on damp.ai/detect. And let's have a listen to the data loggers. So data loggers, I've loaded all your data and put in the temperature of 15.8, which was what it was in the corner. And you can see times when the relative humidity, that green line at the top, is condensing. And it only needs condensation for a relatively short time to create the dampness that you've got in the corner. You can see there are long periods of time when you are keeping, so the blue line, that dark blue line, is the dew point line. The light blue line is the external dew point, and there are times when you're keeping the internal dew point at around the temperature of the outside dew point, which is great. But you notice the times when the internal dew point is well above the outside temperature, and those are the times when you're going to get the condensation. So where it says to the right, that is where you're having. Also look at the line below where you've got the relative dew point. So with the dew point differential, we're looking at the difference between the bedroom at the rear and the bedroom to the front. It would have been better to have seen the kitchen, because that would give you a better idea. But you can see when it's below the line, you're getting more vapor generated in the second sensor, and vice versa. Above the line, more vapor generated in the room where you're focusing on in that case. And in this instance, it's in the rear bedroom. Have a look yourself, and what you want to do is just modify the way you live so that you can bring the internal dew point below the outside temperature, and then you won't have damp issues going forward, and you won't have surveyors going around saying that you've got a rising damp problem when in fact you haven't. So other things to look at, you've got a crack on the outside. It's a vertical one. It's unlikely to be causing internal dampness, but it could marginally dampen the outside brick, and a damp brick is a poor insulator, so it increases the condensation risk. Likewise, where you've got differences in the brickwork. Likewise, in fact, damp proofing treatment increases the risk of dampness from condensation and for mould, because you're reducing the temperature of the wall, because you're putting in an impermeable rather than a permeable substrate. It's important to understand from a surveyor's perspective. Surveyors get sued, and I'll give you some more information on one, but somebody lost about £750,000. Their insurers refused to pay up, and that was because they missed the theoretical risk of dampness. Now that's an example of why surveyors are going to be quick to test for damp at the base of the wall, and and they will recommend going to get a damp proofing contractor to check with a guarantee. And of course, those damp proofing contractors will inevitably want to find dampness. So they're not going to say open the window, because that won't earn them any money. So it's regulated, or it's not regulated. The trade body is the Property Care Association, known as the PCA. There are good and bad elements to them. I think a lot of their timber work is quite good, identifying timber. I would certainly consider anyone that wants to become a surveyor to go through their system, but just keep an open mind and know that they don't test for leaks. They have very scant information on rising damp itself. They'll never show you an example of rising damp. Difficult to know how to identify it if you never see it in the laboratory. And they don't explain the mechanism behind hygroscopic salts, how they move, and they overstate the likelihood that rising damp is the cause of hygroscopic salts when they've got no proof at all. It would be very easy to prove groundwater by just drilling in under the ground. If there is saturated water within a metre of the property, there may be rising damp, but it could also be because of a drain. So you need to take a few readings before you conclude that that there is rising damp. Certainly you shouldn't be making a quote, an estimate, without having genuine evidence. Dampness at the base of wall is no evidence of rising damp. Hygroscopic salts are no evidence of rising damp. The only evidence is groundwater. Have a look at these videos.